hopefully you got, I put out on the email this week a brief with pictures summary of last week. I heard from a couple of you that you were a little overwhelmed by all the content last week. So I tried to just simplify it and make it pretty. So, and I'm going to be referring to the timeline at the top of the document a couple times. There's the 4 major historical events of Isaiah, and then there's the very late historical event. Tonight, in the first 6 chapters, we're going to be going back and forth across the timeline from one end to the other. It really does jump around that much.
Excuse me, Rick, was that sent only to the people who were on the call last week?
Nope, sent to the whole congregation in the Isaiah email that went out.
Okay. I just got back today, so I'll check it out. Okay,
no problem. And if you don't get it, just email me in the morning or something, and I'll send you a fresh copy.
Thank you.
It went out at 6 a.m. this morning.
Thank you.
6 a.m. this morning. I scheduled it. I wasn't up at 6 a.m. doing my email.
All right.
So before we get going, some of us have already started talking about translations. I am using John Goldingay's, thank you so much. John Goldingay's translation of the Old Testament that he calls the First Testament. And with the bits of the text that I'm going to put on the screen here for us to look at are all coming from John Goldingay's translation. Some of you said that you found Isaiah difficult. It's very poetic. It sounds like it's Shakespeare. One of the things about John Goldingay's translation is he uses very modern English, very modern, and so kind of cuts through some of the Shakespearean tones of it. One of the quirky things about the translation is he preserves the Hebrew names of people and places. For example, here is the Isaiah 1:1 in his translation. The vision of Yeshayahu, who is Isaiah ben Amoz, which he beheld concerning Yehuda, which is Judah, the southern kingdom, and Jerusalem, hopefully we see that's Jerusalem, in the days of Uzziyahu, or Hezekiah, Yotam, Ahaz, and Yehizkiyahu, kings of Yehuda. So I know that one sentence is ridiculous, but the rest of it, I promise you, gets better. The language, when we're not talking about people and places, is a lot clearer, I think. So we're going to be going through the first 6 chapters. There are going to be bits that I'll read on the screen, and then I'll say a few words. I'll ask if there's questions, comments, and then we'll go on. I'm obviously not going to go verse by verse through the entire 6 chapters, or we will be here until tomorrow morning. I've picked out some of the highlights of the first 6 chapters. If in your reading I don't get to one of the things that you were intrigued about or had questions about at the end, we can go back through those things. As we get to the end, I think when we get to the 4th chapter and then the 6th chapter, I'm going to stop interpreting, and I'm going to say, what do you think?
How do I do my face?
All right.
You, Sarah, I'm not gonna.
Hello. No one can see your face at all right now because I think the whole screen is covered up. So.
Oh, okay.
All right.
All right.
I'm in. Display it.
Perfect timing because we're starting right now with the first chapter. So Isaiah chapter 1 is in some ways a miniature of the entire book. It starts as a blistering judgment and it ends in hope. which is exactly what the whole book does. Isaiah basically starts with 12 chapters of judgment, and that's not the end of the judgment. It keeps going, but then the end of it, we get to this beautiful section of hope and future promise, which is kind of great. So here is part of that judgment. And you'll see right away the modern language of this translation. Hey, wrongdoing nation, a people heavy with waywardness, offspring of people who deal badly, devastating children. They've abandoned Yahweh. They've disdained Israel's sacred one. They've become estranged, backwards. Will you be struck down more? Will you continue being defiant? The whole head has come to sickness. The whole mind is faint. So here we are in the very beginning of the Isaiah timeline. This is the Ciro Ephraimite War. This is where the nation of, there's an alliance between Samaria, or Israel, the northern kingdom, and another nation called Aram. It's an alliance against Assyria. If you have this thing, you can see I did a little graphic of what map to show the nations we're talking about. That alliance is trying to get the southern kingdom of Judah to join them, and the southern kingdom doesn't join them. It instead joins Assyria, and they end up destroying Israel, Samaria. So here's this is the situation here, and what God is trying to do, and it's going to become clearer when we get to chapter 7, the beginning of next week, is God is trying to convince Ahaz not to play politics. There's last week we showed all of the political connections that were going on, and Game of Thrones that were going back and forth, and God through Isaiah is telling Ahaz, the king of Judah, to trust in God and not his own political prowess, not an alliance with a foreign nation. And we'll see that Ahaz does not enter into a political alliance with the northern kingdom and with Aram. However, he does enter into the alliance with Assyria. And it starts out fine, but it ends up not. And so that's where we're at. But it's not just politics. Isaiah is not just about what kings are doing or not doing. It's also about what's generally happening in the nation. So here in verse 16, wash, get clean. Remove the badness of your practices from in front of my eyes. Stop dealing badly. Learn doing good. Require the exercise of authority, which sort of means like right living, following God's authority. Put the oppressor right, like put the person who oppresses people in their place. Exercise authority for the orphan. Argue for the widow. Come on, please, let's argue it out, Yahweh says. If your wrongdoings are like scarlet, they're to be white like snow. If they're red like crimson, they're to be like wool. He sees people oppressing other people. In the Old Testament, there's a triumvirate that shows up over and over and over again, and it's widows, orphans, and foreigners. And throughout the Torah and throughout the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, we see over and over again God imploring his people to deal with these people who are the most vulnerable in society, deal with them well. In the prophets, we see them emerge again because no one treats them well. and it's part of the judgment. So this isn't just about what a king did or didn't do. It was about society, how it treats the most vulnerable among us. And because we're going to take a couple verses back, because of this, because of the political machinations, and because of the lack of justice, the worship that the people of God were performing in the temple become something that is detestable to God. So God says here in chapter 11, verse 11, "What use to me is the large number of your sacrifices?" Yahweh says, "I'm full of burnt offerings of ram and the fat of fatlings, in the blood of bulls and lambs and goats. I do not delight. When you come to appear to my face, who sought this from your hand, trampling my courtyards? You will do it no more, bringing an empty offering. Incense is an offense to me. New month, Sabbath, the calling of a convocation. I cannot bear trouble and assembly. Your new moons and your appointed times, my entire being dislikes. They've become a burden to me that I'm weary of carrying." It's not just because God doesn't like sacrifices. In fact, in the Torah, especially the entire book of Leviticus, God lays out exactly how God wants sacrifices to go and how important they are and how it's to be an integral part of the life of Israel. It's just that when they perform these great rituals, but then they are not following him when it comes to politics, and they're subjugating the most vulnerable among them, it means nothing, and it becomes detestable to God. But as I said, the first chapter does end with some hope. It's not all condemnation, but the hope does come with a little bit of a hook in it. "But I shall smelt your slag as with lye, remove all your contamination. I shall restore your leaders as of old, your counselors as at the beginning. Afterwards, you will be called Faithful Town, Trustworthy Township. Zion," that's Mount Zion, like the city of Jerusalem, "will find redemption through the exercise of authority, and the people in it who turn back through faithfulness." So redemption, a restoration of the old relationship will come. It's going to happen. We have to wait a little bit, but to get there, the people need to be smelted. Smelting is refining. It's where you would melt down a metal to then try and remove its impurities, and you would do it again, and then you would do it again, and then you would do it again, and then finally you would have something that would be pure. So God says he's going to refine God's people, and there'll be a future time of hope. But in order to get there, we're going to need to go through some heat. We continue on with the theme of hope. And the hope that we see in chapter 2 becomes not just hope in the particular historical context, but it's a hope that will come one day. And this is a future hope, a future glory. This is a major theme in the book of Isaiah. If you're taking notes here, this is where you want to like circle things and underline them and put stars. The future glory, the age when all will be made right, we're going to come back to again and again and again. It is one of the reasons why I said that the book of Isaiah is oftentimes called the fifth gospel, because the first Christians, when they read Isaiah and they heard about this future age of glory, they said, oh, that's the age of the coming of Christ. So Isaiah 2:2-3, it will come at the end of time. The mountain of Yahweh's house will have become established at the head of the mountains, and it will lift up higher than the hills. All the nations will stream to it. Many peoples will come and say, come on, let's go up to Yahweh's mountain, to the house of Jacob's God. He will exercise authority among the nations and issue reproof to many peoples. They'll beat their swords into hoes, their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not carry sword against nation. They will no more learn about battle. Jacob's household, come on, let's walk by Yahweh's light. I want you to notice here that this age of future glory is not just an age of glory for Israel, for Judah, for the Jewish people. But when Isaiah talks about this age that is to come, when all will be made right and war will be no more, it's not just for one nation, it's for all nations, which is really, if you've done a lot of reading in the Old Testament, particularly the early Testament, the early Old Testament is laser focused on God's people, Israel, Judah, the Jewish people. But here, Isaiah sort of lifts up his eyes and says, it's not just for this one nation. God isn't concerned just about this one people, but the entire earth. And this age of future glory is for all peoples. Again, another reason why it's identified as the fifth gospel, because obviously Jesus didn't just come for one nation, for one people, but for all peoples. And that's just what I just said. Okay. There's a phrase as I continue to use John Goldingay's translation. You'll see this a lot, Lord of Armies or Yahweh of Armies. And this is, anybody know what the normal translation would be in almost every other Bible? What would normally be here?
Hosts.
Lord God of hosts. In Hebrew, the word that is translated hosts, or here armies, is the word Sava, which is the singular, or Savaot, which is the plural. It is the word for army. Just like if you looked at a Jeep that was part of the armed forces of the United States, on the back of it, it would probably say Army. On the door, it would say Army, right? U.S. Army. If you look at a Jeep that's from the Israeli army today, it says Saba on the back of it. And so John Goldingay preserves that probably more accurate interpretation, the Lord of Armies. And you can sort of think about the hosts of heaven, the army of angels and saints that are in God's kingdom. Okay. Chapter 3, verses 1 and 8. Because there, the Lord of armies, the Lord of hosts, is removing from Jerusalem and from Yehuda supply and support, all supply of bread and all supply of water, because Jerusalem has collapsed, Yehuda has fallen. What? What happened? We were in the Ciro Ephraimite War when Israel collapsed. The northern kingdom collapsed, not Jerusalem and Yehuda. What happened? I mean, eventually Assyria comes and lays siege against Jerusalem, which is the fourth point on here. But if you remember from last week, Assyria doesn't crash through the doors. They're never able to conquer Judah or Jerusalem. They sort of run away with their tail between their legs. So what happened? Well, we have jumped the timeline. Sorry, I can't do this with the camera. From the very beginning, where we were a moment ago in the Ciro Ephraimite War, all the way to the end, almost 150 years later, after Babylon has destroyed Jerusalem. This isn't warning that one day this terrible thing's going to happen. It has happened. Was somebody trying to talk? No. Okay. So, as I said last week, one of the things that scholars say that makes Isaiah so difficult is that it jumps around the timeline. So when we jump around the timeline, I'm going to let you know it so you know basically where we're at. You've burned up the vineyard. The humble person's plunder is in your houses, which means like you've stolen, like there's poor people, people who are have of humble means, and you've taken what is theirs. You've stolen from them, either by actually stealing from them or by bad business practices that are not ethical, and you've taken their stuff and you put it in your house. What do you mean that you crush my people, grind the faces of humble ones? A declaration of the Lord Yahweh of armies. Again, this is not just about the Game of Thrones and kings doing something or not doing something, but it's about how the most vulnerable among us are being treated. And one of the reasons God is saying to Isaiah and to us here that Jerusalem eventually fell back in around 586 BC is because they grinded the faces of those who were poor. Here's a section I'm going to read this, and then I want you just to offer your own reflections on this, and specifically, does it remind you of anything? Okay. If the Lord has washed away the filth of Zion's daughters and cleanses from within it the shed blood of Jerusalem, Yahweh will create over the entire establishment of Mount Zion and over its meeting place a cloud by day and smoke and a brightness of flaming fire by night, because over all the splendor will be a canopy, and it will be a bivouac for shade by day from the heat, and for shelter, and for a hiding place from the storm and from rain. What do you hear any echoes from earlier in Israel's story?
Yeah, I hear similarity to Moses leading the people through the desert for the 40 years.
Yep. Exodus. Pillar of fire.
Yep. In this, and that in that incredibly vulnerable time when Israel did not even remember what it was like to be their own people. They did not know what it was like to be their own nation, to be in charge of their own affairs, because they had been enslaved for over 400 years. And now they're out of the grips of Pharaoh and their slave masters. In that time, God was with them. And we always can say, like, well, God's with us through thick and through thin. But in that moment, God was with them in a visual and physical way, and by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. It was meant to be a source of comfort and safety for God's people. It was also meant to be a menacing presence to anyone who would ever want to harm them. And so what Isaiah is saying here is that there's in this time that will eventually come of hope and redemption, God's presence is going to really come again. Not where they can just say, well, God's with us, but they can say God's with us, and you can see God right there. This is again one of the reasons why Isaiah so captivated the early Christians, because they saw this physical manifestation of God's presence among them as Jesus, and then eventually as the Holy Spirit. That it's not just well wishes that God is with us, but that God is really with us.
So it's not literal. Just a question, Rick. So that was actually, as you said, it was a reference to what happened with Moses.
Mm-hmm.
But that same thing that is written there is not going to happen again literally, right? It's something that is spiritualized as far as Christ and his appearing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone 700 years before Jesus's birth was reading that and thinking, "Oh, Jesus is coming 700 years from now." I think for them, it was, "Oh, God is going to be like with us, like God was with us in the day of Moses." And again, like I said at the beginning, that a lot of Isaiah it's in the form of poetry, and so whether they thought that like there's going to be an actual pillar again or not, the thing that they were waiting for was for God's presence to come. A little bit later on the timeline, Jews in what we call the Second Temple, once so Babylon destroyed Jerusalem right here in 586, 587. They were in 70 years in Babylon as slaves. Cyrus of Persia defeats the Babylonians, and he inherits the Judahites, the residents of Jerusalem. He says, "Go home, rebuild." They rebuild their city, then their nation, and their temple. And we know, because we have the writings of the ancient rabbis, they kept waiting for the cloud to come again. And when they wrote lists of things that were present in the first temple but aren't present in the second temple, one of the things they wrote was, "There's no cloud." So they were waiting for the day when the cloud would come again. So Christians, several hundred years after that, picked up Isaiah and said, "Oh, what we're talking about here isn't just a cloudy pillar, but we're talking about a physical manifestation of God, and we believe that to be Christ." So that different people along the timeline picking up this book
Sure.
got things out of it.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, good. So the 5th chapter is one of the literary highlights of the whole book. It is called the Song or the Hymn of the Vineyard. And I've put out a portion of the Hymn of the Vineyard. And I want you to think, what's the vineyard? And he talks about this person who has a vineyard. Who is that? So think about those questions as I read this. "I want to sing a song for my friend, my love song about his vineyard. My friend had a vineyard on a fertile ridge. He dug it, de-stoned it, and planted it with choice wine. He built a tower in the middle of it, and also hewed a press in it. He hoped it would make grapes." So what do you think is going on here? This is poetic. So like, we're not talking about an actual vineyard. We're talking about a poetic vineyard. So what's the vineyard?
The house of Israel.
Yeah, it's Jerusalem, Mount Zion, the promised land that God has given them.
And the Israelites are the plants.
Right, that God, the grapes, are in the New Testament. Jesus frequently talks about bearing fruit. This is the grapes were the fruit of faith that he was hoping that that they would produce in this vineyard. It's such a tender image. It's a hands-on image, almost like the image in the New Testament of God being a potter. You know, God's the potter and we're the clay. It's this like hands-on, that God is not aloof and a jillion miles away and could care less, but God is right in it, you know, and he digs it, he takes the stones out, he plants it, he hopes for it. You know, you could almost say this is the story of a parent talking about their children. Jerry, right? You know, and your household, and you're cleaning up stuff you wish you wouldn't be cleaning up, right? Like, yeah, you're cooking dinner for a bunch of people that don't even want to eat what you're cooking them. Like you're doing all this stuff because of how much love that you have for them, and you hope for grapes. You hope for great things.
I also couldn't help but think, if you go back to the quote, that it reminded me of us. I don't know why, but I read it. You know, I it's a song for a friend, and I see a vineyard on a fertile ridge, and I see someone building a tower in the middle of it, and he hopes it can make grapes. Sort of like that. It's a local reference. It's nice.
Yeah, it said he just got wild grapes though.
Yes.
Good luck with your vineyard, Rick.
So here's how it goes. So now population of Jerusalem, people of Judah, decide, please, between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard and I didn't do in it? Why, when I hoped for it to make grapes, did it make rotten grapes? You know, God saying like, I kind of did everything I knew what to do. I'm not sure there was anything else to do. And you guys kind of messed this up, which again, you can see we're back in that, this long theme of judgment here. It is a little jarring to have this like tender, beautiful image of what God is doing, and then God's people not living up to what God had hoped for. And now it gets even worse. So now the judgment comes full circle. So now I want to let you know, please, what I am doing about my vineyard. Remove its hedge, so it will be for burning up. Break down its wall, so it will be for trampling, so that I make an end of it. It won't be pruned, and it won't be hoed. Briar and thorn will grow. I shall order the clouds not to send rain on it. And this is, again, we are here now on the timeline where Jerusalem has been destroyed. Its protective walls were torn down. The city was burned. And so there's some poetry here, but there's also some actual history mixed in. And so, you know, the people reading this would have known, this is not just a vineyard. This is what happened to us in Jerusalem when Babylon came knocking on our door. Because the vineyard of the God of hosts is the household of Israel, the people of Judah are the planting in which he took pleasure. He hoped for the exercise of authority, but their blood pouring out, for faithfulness, but there a cry. This is, if you've ever studied Isaiah before, you will know this verse, because there is in the Hebrew, a very famous play on words. So the exercise of authority is the Hebrew word mishpat. It's used throughout the Old Testament for faithful living. God hoped for mishpat, but what he got instead was mispah, blood pouring out. Close, right? Like we were just one little letter off, but that one little letter mattered a lot. God hoped for faithfulness, tzedakah. Again, another incredibly important word. If you ever study biblical Hebrew, this is one of like the first 20 words you'll learn. But instead of faithfulness, instead of tzedakah, he gets a cry, se'aku. And so you can really see, Lucia, how this is a poem, because we're even using allusion and play on words, as you know you do in sort of classic poetry. Okay, we're coming to the close of what I have. The 6th chapter is monumental. It is incredibly important in the book of Isaiah. And I want to give you some time to play with it and think about it and ask questions about it. It has one of the most stirring images, and it's the call scene of Isaiah. We talked about this a little bit last week, like how did Isaiah become a prophet? How did he get to speak for God? He was called, and this was his call. It's also memorialized in the kind of fun and stirring hymn, "Here I Am, Lord." Here I am, Lord, it is I, Lord. So maybe I'll have Michael play that this week or coming up soon. But then we get to talk about what happens after the "Here I Am." So here it is. In the year that King Uzziah died, and this is before the timeline a little bit. We're talking, this is before the Ciro Ephraimite War. So he's called a prophet before all that happens. In the year King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lofty, with his train filling the palace. Seraphs were standing above him. Each had 6 wings. With 2, it would cover its face. With 2, it would cover its feet. With 2, it would fly. And 1 would call to the other. Last Wednesday was the feast of St. Michael and all angels. And at the Wednesday service, I said that most people have this very beautiful vision of what angels look like, what angelic beings are, as being sort of like cherub faces and soft, like dove-like wings. And seraphs, which are angelic creatures, are not that. They have 6 wings, and they cry out, and their cries shake the foundations of the heavenly temple. These aren't like little demure creatures who are sitting on pinnacles or something like that. One would call to another, in this translation, "Sacred, sacred, sacred, Yahweh of armies." Anybody say what we would normally translate this as?
Holy, holy,
Holy, holy, holy.
Lord of all,
Lord Almighty.
Lord of,
Lord, right. We say these words almost every single Sunday, at least every single Sunday that we celebrate communion. Holy, 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 Lord God of hosts. Heaven and earth are full of your glory, right?
Mhm.
Right. Those words are ripped right out of Isaiah. I think about these words here every time we say them on Sunday morning. This isn't really about Isaiah, the book, but sort of a theology of worship. When we can sometimes think smallly about what we do in this place, like we come here to sing songs that hymns that hopefully we like, and hear a sermon that hopefully we like, and sort of like feel good about ourselves and come away learning something and seeing people around us. And all that is true. That's one aspect. But the other aspect is that worship doesn't begin at 8 o'clock in the morning here, or 10 o'clock in the morning, or 5 o'clock in the evening. Worship is something that's already going on. And at 8 o'clock in the morning, 10 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock at night, or whenever, we plug into the worship that's already going on. Angels are already around the throne singing holy, holy, holy. And then we join in. We get to play a little bit of part, a little role in the earthly part of the heavenly chorus. So I leave that to you to think about what we do on Sunday morning. So again, these angelic creatures singing, the doorposts on the sills, the lintels above the doors of the heavenly temple shook at the sound of the one who called, while the whole house was filled with smoke. And remember, if you're a rabbi in the second temple and you're just aching for smoke in the temple in Jerusalem, and here in the heavenly temple, there it is. I said, this is Isaiah saying, me, because I'm ruined, because I'm a man of polluted lips, and I live among a people of polluted lips. He's all of a sudden, whenever I think of the scene, I think of, here's this human being, this little guy standing in the heavenly throne room, and angels are singing, and the whole thing's shaking, and there's God on the throne. And I just sort of imagine him just like curling up in the corner, seeing all of this going on and sort of coming to grips with his own unworthiness and his own smallness. And he realizes that he's not sort of worthy of seeing this because of who he is and who he lives among. And he says, because my eyes have seen the King, Yahweh of armies. But one of the seraphs flew to me, in his hand a coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar. Remember, if you did our forum series on the temple, an altar, we think of an altar as a table that things are set upon. In the ancient world, that would not be an altar. No one from 3,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, if you brought them in here and you said, where's the altar? They'd be like, I don't know. I don't see an altar. Because an altar back then was like a big barbecue. Things were burnt on it. And so this angel takes a coal that he had taken from the altar. He made it touch my mouth. And he said, this has touched your lips, and your waywardness will depart. Your wrongdoing will be expiated. Remember a bit earlier, we talked about smelting and the refining that comes with heat and fire, that we're sort of taking the impurities out. And that's exactly what we see here again. This angel is helping remove all that is impure from Isaiah. I heard the Lord's voice saying, whom shall I send? Who will go for us? I said, here I am, send me. And if you just stopped there, this would be a beautiful little section. I am going to stop here for a second. Don't read on. Any thoughts, questions, comments about this heavenly throne room scene?
Is the person who's being sent, I assume it's Isaiah?
Yeah, this is Isaiah. This is Isaiah speaking in the first person. Because
he's sort of very abstractly there through most of this so far. So here he's actually there. Okay. Yeah. I mean, yeah. And how is he there? Was he, plucked off of earth and taken to heaven? Did he have a vision of it in sort of ecstasy? Did he behold this in a dream that was given him by God? I mean, we sort of see God give people visions in various ways throughout the Bible. So Isaiah doesn't give us any of the mechanics of how this happens. I said, I saw the Lord.
Rick, is there a parallel to similar scenes in Revelations here as well?
Absolutely. In fact, the bits of the Old Testament and the New Testament. And there's just a few of them. There's the book of Daniel, there's the book of Revelation. We get these little glimpses into what the heavenly throne room looks like, and that vision of what the heavenly throne room looks like is remarkably consistent throughout the probably 1,000 years that these bits were written down. So there's definitely a connection between all of them.
Well, what struck me was how he accepts what God is saying is happening. He accepts the forgiveness, and he feels like he's worthy to answer a question that's put to him.
Yeah, Isaiah here bucks against the typical prophetic call scene. I think I mentioned this last week too, but usually when a prophet is called, and I mean usually by the other prophetic books where we get prophetic call scenes, we see it in as early as the book of Judges, when a judge was called up by God. The normal thing is when God says, hey, I want you to go and do this for me, the first thing they do is say no. Moses does this too. Moses is like, I can't go. I have a speech impediment. I can't do this. Oh, I can't do it. No one's going to believe me. I can't do this. I don't know your name. So like the first thing prophet does is come up with a bunch of excuses why they can't do it. And usually it's 3. They try to get out of it 3 times. And then by the 4th time, God usually amps up the anger a little bit. Like, I've asked you to do this thing, you need to go do it. And then they acquiesce. Isaiah doesn't have any of that. Isaiah's call scene is sort of reminiscent of Mary's call scene, where God comes to her in the angel Gabriel, and she says, okay, I'll do this thing. I'll bear Jesus into the world.
Did you turn him down 3 times yourself, Rick, before you got going?
You know, so my first calls, I mean, the first time like that ever entered into my consciousness was I think I've said this before, there was a bunch of little old ladies in my Methodist church growing up that would squeeze my cheeks and say, oh, Ricky, you make a great minister. And I, for a long time, said, absolutely not. No, I couldn't imagine that. It wasn't until I went off to college that eventually that sort of soaked in, and I was like, okay, I think I might be able. Now, I don't know if I said no 3 times. It might have been more, but
3 little ladies.
What's that?
3 little ladies.
3 little ladies. Yes. When they make the musical about my life, there'll be 3 little ladies that will come and squeeze my cheek.
3 little ladies are school or we. Yeah?
That's right. little fairy godmothers.
Right.
So let me ask you this. If you were in the temple and the whole thing was shaking and creatures were flying with wings, with 6 wings and all of that, and God says, who am I going to send? Would you speak up?
No.
Well, maybe if I'd gone through what he'd gone through and you'd put this coal in my lips and I've already experienced that, that's a bit of a push there, you know? Okay, now I'm special, or I've been singled out.
Right.
Maybe a young man would do it. Yeah.
Remember, it's God that's asking.
Right. But he doesn't even say, it's not even, will you go? The way God sort of phrases it, it's like, well, who am I going to send? Who's going to go for? Like he's sort of like talking to himself, talking about the Trinity. And Isaiah in the corner of the temple goes, okay, I'll go. I find it to be kind of remarkable. You know, it's one of those moments that you kind of like hope you would have it in yourself to do, but aren't always sure that you would.
Right.
But so he says, here I am, send me. And usually when we read this in church, this is where we stop. And we all go, oh, Isaiah went and he did it. But the rest of it's this. God said, he said, go and say this to the people. Keep listening, but don't understand. Keep looking, but don't acknowledge. Fatten this people's mind. Make its ears heavy. Smear its eyes so it doesn't see with its eyes and listen with its ears, and its mind understands and it turns and there is healing for it. I said, for how long, Lord? He said, until towns have crashed into ruins so that there is no inhabitant, and houses so that there are no people, and the land crashes into ruins, a desolation. Yahweh will send the people away. Vast will be the abandonment in the middle of the country. When there is still a tenth in it, it will again be for burning up. And let me stop there. Basically what he's saying is, I'm going to send you, and it's going to be an utter failure.
That's terrible. I've now just volunteered for this, and you're going to shoot me down.
Exactly.
So horrible.
Right.
Yep. After your lips have been burned with coals.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what kind of a disappointment that you're going and you're not going to get, it's not going to be glory. It's not going to be everything works out and you get to save the day. And no, like everything's going to be terrible. And then everything's going to crash around you. For how long? Can you hear it? Like, how long am I going to have to do that? Well, until the whole thing crumbles. Oh.
But of course, he is doing what the Lord wants him to do, and so the Lord would be pleased with what he's told to do.
Yeah. But he doesn't get to do the fun thing. You know, he doesn't get to be Jonah and save an entire city.
Exactly.
I mean, Jonah was miserable, so.
Oh, Jonah was miserable. Yes, he was miserable for other reasons, though.
It was fun in the whale stomach.
Right.
But sometimes you have to hit rock bottom before you can rise again. So is that what he's saying there?
Yes, I think he is, because we propel. I mean, we've been in this almost 6 full chapters of judgment, and you've done this and you've done that, and you've forgotten these people and you've forgotten me here. It's been 6 chapters of judgment, and yet eventually you're going to have to go through all this. You're going to have to go through this refining, the fire, and be smelted and be refined, and then wondrous things are going to happen for Jerusalem and for the whole world.
Like Phoenix rising from the ashes.
Like a phoenix rising. Exactly. It's exactly right. Yeah. And so at the very end, verse 13 of Isaiah is that phoenix. I mean, like, and after typing out the verses prior to this, when I typed this next verse up, I got like, what are they called? Goosebumps. But there, like a terebinth, or like an oak of which there's a stump after their felling, the sacred seed will be its stump. Like there's this thing left over, and out of this stump, a shoot is going to pop out of it. It's not just a dead thing, but it's the beginning of something new. Ooh, okay, now I can go for you, right? Like, okay, now we're going to go through this horrible thing. I know on the other end that things are going to be so much better than they were even now. And this is another huge theme in Isaiah. This is another time you might want to like circle and put stars and underline. It's the theme of the remnant, that the whole thing's going to fall apart, but not the whole thing. The whole thing's going to come crashing down, but not the whole thing, because there will be a little bit left over. And from that little bit, great things are going to pop out. And so we're going to see this theme of the remnant and that which has been left over, sprouting forth something great again and again in our journey through Isaiah.
Would you refer to the remnant as being like a resurrection?
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could see that. I mean, I guess you could probably see, Christ's body in the tomb as a remnant, like all has been lost, but not all has been lost, right? I guess, yeah. I mean, it's sort of that standard. There's a thread through the Bible of, defeat after defeat after defeat that really should have been the end. And yet none of those defeats are ever the end, but they're always the beginning of something new. And the resurrection is the greatest example of that. I mean, the story should have ended with Jesus in the tomb, and that was it. Rome won, the big guy won, the religious leaders of Jerusalem won, and we all go home and cry ourselves to sleep. But then the tomb was empty on the third day. There was that remnant, that thing at the end.
So there's always hope. Who said hope springs eternal? Is that like Shakespeare or something? I don't know.
I don't know.
Either. Where'd that come from?
But it works. It definitely works here. But before I just bring us back to the regular Zoom view, next week we're going to do chapters 7 through 12. We're still going to be in judgment. It's basically the first 12/14 chapters, which is judgment. But there's some good stuff in there, including chapter 7, which we'll get to right when we kick things off next week, which is one of the most famous bits of the Old Testament for Christians. We hear it every Advent and Christmas. So